Hello, this lesson is on Chapter 5, Accounting Reports. Now, as you can see, I don't have Chapter 5 open yet. This is actually part of the overview chapter in Chapter 1. Just a reminder that our Big 6 reports here, the effect on the Big 6 we've talked about, we've actually viewed all of these reports during the class. And so I just want to point out again that the menu path to each of these reports is listed. And so you might want to mark a note, sticky note or something on page 7 of your handbook. And again, as it says, once you grasp how transactions and other actions entered in the UN affect these 6 reports, you're well on your way to understanding how they will post on the many other reports provided in the UN system. Well, in this lesson, we're not going to go over every report in the UN software. That would just be too much. We've got, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how many there is total, but it's well over the amount of time we have. So we're just going to, this is actually just a couple pages. You can use this as a reference when you're first starting out, Chapter 5. And I'm going to go over some principles to look for in reports and kind of show you how transactions affect reports in general. Excuse me. Oops. Get you back to the software. Okay, so going to our accounting software, as you can see, we've been there a number of times. If you go to Accounting Reports and Statements, here you have a list of all of your reporting groups, and they're in alphabetical order. Like I said, it can be quite a bit to navigate through. I'd recommend really going through and printing, once you get some data, of course, if you're converting to UN, once you get some data in the software and you get completely, at least your maintenance section set up when you've converted and entered in the software, go through and print some reports. And once you get a few transactions, experiment. And it's worthwhile checking all the reports that are relevant to you so that you can, you might not need them today, but I've had customers who've called and said they've been working in the UN for a couple years, and I show them a report, and they're like, wow, I wish I had that, a year ago. I've been looking at putting these 2 reports together and combining them on my, writing them out on my own because I didn't realize that. Well, I don't want you to be in that situation. It's best to, once you get maybe a month's worth of data, to go through and familiarize, print them all out once. Not going to, for 1 month, it's not going to kill a tree. Print them all out and get an idea of what is where. That way, even though you might not need it now, maybe 6 months from now you realize, wow, I could really use that. I wish I had a report. Oh yeah, I do have a report that shows that information very clearly. So that's a recommendation. Now, we're going to focus most of our time here on the accounting reports and statements. There are also reports under the other modules, budgetary, obviously inventory, related to those modules. So we're not going to look at those. We may look at a few under the general module. You can see there's a few here related. Most of those are related to the general module setup, maintenance. There is one that's set of reports, a group for vendor payees that relates to accounting. So we'll touch on that for a moment. But back to the accounting module. Now, since there are so many reports, we try to make it easier for you to access these reports while you're working on a transaction or a maintenance item related to that, related to what you're looking for. So, for instance, if you're in accounting, maintenance, budgets, appropriation budgets, then you can look under related screens, and I've done this a number of times, And we try to place other screens, including report screens, that are related to this. So obviously, appropriation budgets. A related screen would be appropriation reports. But also maybe some things you might not think about, like the budgetary reports or the appropriation supplemental report. If I click on appropriation supplemental report, I can see that this lists all of these supplemental budget changes that I've recorded throughout the year. And we'll get to the other options in that in just a moment. Actually, that's interesting. Maybe I'll leave that one open. So that's true for all of these areas. Under utilities, we can see appropriation accounts, budgets, and then appropriation reports again. Or if I look under actually, if you click on transactions, click on receipts, you can see that changes. And here I've got cash reports. There's a lot of reports related to that. Receipt reports, fund reports, revenue reports. So you can open up those types, and that's kind of a reminder that these are related to this transaction. Same goes for utilities. Click on purchase order utility. I'll see the purchase order reports like appropriation reports or purchase order reports related to that function. Okay, so I'll go back to reports and statements. And let's start off with appropriation reports. Appropriation status, well, that's one of our big six we've been looking at for quite a while now. You'll see that on certain reports you don't have all the options for every report available. So if we look here under appropriation status, if I drop down to the date section here, it's going to display on most of your report group screens, but if it's not relevant to the appropriate to a type of report, it'll be grayed out. So here, month, quarter, and year really aren't relevant to the appropriation status, because if you recall, I mentioned that most of the reports that have the label status are sort of a point-in-time report. So what is my status of my appropriations as of a particular date? So for those, we just have the as of date. So I could say, well, maybe as of March, or as of, even go back to January 1st and look at the current year and look at my appropriations as of that date. The information changes when we select those account codes, because based on the date selected. So we can see some other examples of this, such as under the revenue reports, the revenue status. We've got the as of date, and I'll also open up the fund reports, the fund status as of date. So those are all date specific. But going back to appropriations, if there's only one report, well, it'll show up in this drop-down menu, but usually you have a group of reports. So make sure you click the arrow whenever you see that. And for instance, here we have, it looks like about 7 different reports under appropriation status, under the appropriation group. So for instance, if I click on the appropriation ledger, whenever you see the term ledger or journal, that usually means it's a very detailed report, and you can narrow it down by specific dates. It's not it's not a point in time. It's going to show you every transaction within the period you select. So here I could select January, February, or March, or April, since I don't, I just have a data set here. I don't have the entire year up to currently it's September 2nd. Or I could select the entire year. And when I select the items on my list, it's going to display a report for the entire year in Appropriation Ledger. Or I could say for a specific period, well, I only want to see the transactions using these appropriation account codes for the period of February 14th through, give me through the end of the year automatically, but maybe through February 14th through February, oops, can't go backwards. Your start date, February 14th through February 20th. Okay, so for 1 week. So it's going to, I can narrow it down by 1 week or even 1 day. Here I've got nothing that occurred in February 14th. But I can narrow it down to even a day and print the ledger related to that day, or like I said, for the entire year. And again, now this is just, now of course this list here, it does have some information, but don't look at these reports and think, oh, okay, this represents this report. This report has a lot more detail than what you see on the screen. This is just sort of like a little preview form for you to get an idea of what you're selecting. But if and I'll show you that once when we get to it, I'll display this. But I want to show you the tabs on the right. The tabs on the right, again, will grayed out if they're not relevant for the particular report you selected. So here, for every report, you will have a paper tab with the size and the orientation. And based on your user preferences, which we'll get to in the general maintenance section later on, it's going to default to different settings. And if you have the UEN settings, the UN default set, then it'll just show you what we recommend size and orientation for this report. So this is a ledger report. It's very detailed. So we recommend legal size paper, 8.5 by 14. And then our orientation would be landscape. So the wide type of paper. It will print a wide document versus portrait, which is a tall document. If we look at the fund reports and look at the fund status, we can see that the UN defaults are letter size, 8.5 by 11, and then portrait, because that makes the most sense to us for this report. You might disagree, and you're welcome to change this to legal and landscape. So each are customizable. Now, like for instance, we've seen the fund status plenty of times, and we've seen how display works. It displays the report on the screen, so I'll go ahead and click that. And you know, there's not a lot of columns to this report, not a lot of information, so it makes sense to have that as landscape. I'm sorry, as wide, not wide, but tall. Let me look at the settings here. I'm losing my wording here. Letter and portrait. But I could certainly, if I really preferred, change this to legal and landscape, and it would look like this. So it's going to print 8.5 by 14 and spread everything out here. Well, it doesn't make sense to me, but you might like everything at 8.5 by 14, and you're welcome to choose that. Now, if I go to the appropriation reports, my ledger, I could also, this makes sense to us to print this, I got to select something, to print this detailed report in a wide landscape and 8.5 by 14, because there's a lot of detail on this report. But again, you could choose to squeeze this down to letter size, and that's all right. It'll be get out your magnifying glass. It's going to be pretty tiny. Now, some of this just doesn't make any sense. You could say letter size and portrait, and it's going to look kind of funny. So this is really tiny magnifying glass because it's squeezing down the font, but it does allow you to do so. Now notice I've got this set at letter portrait. If I change my report and then come back to appropriation ledger, it resets it back to the default, and it will do that every time. So be aware of that fact. Okay, Another feature here, we have several tabs. Well, you might have filters for some reports. So this is relevant for some reports like the Appropriation Chart of Accounts. Well, here, the Chart of Accounts, actually notice there's no dates for the Chart of Accounts. This isn't really has to do with dates. It just has to do with what you added to your custom township Chart of Accounts, the accounts that we use in budget for a township. So it's not really relevant. And then if we look at the filters, you'll notice that this is filtered by the active account codes. If I click on the drop-down menu, I can filter it by the inactive account code. Remember how we deactivated the capital outlay? So if you're going to make a transaction payment, maybe a purchase order or a payment, and you don't see an account code, this is a good report to look at. Come to your Chart of Accounts and change the filter to inactive, and it'll list out all of those that you've made inactive. And you could go to your related screens, go back to your appropriation accounts, and find that inactive account and reactivate it if you want to. And then you can make your payment. So that's how some of these things work together. We've got, so I'm going to list all of my active accounts, but be aware, if I don't look under filters, there are certain defaults. So you want to get used to what the defaults are. Usually, if there's something like that, active or inactive, or open versus closed, by default, it's going to be open, like with purchase orders. It'll just show the open purchase orders, but you can always change that to the closed purchase orders, or select all, and it'll show all of the accounts for the year, or all of the purchase orders for the year, whether they're open or closed. So if I select this and I display it, here we got our Appropriation Chart of Accounts. Thought I'd just show you this one, because remember how we said some accounts are direct charge and some of them are require a purchase order. Well, once you select that account for your specific Chart of Accounts, you can look here and at this report, and it shows you what the yes or no question, whether it accepts just direct charges or if it requires a purchase order. So a little side note there. All right, another thing is sorting. Well, some of these, it's not applicable, or maybe at this point in time, our programmers intend to add that feature, but it hasn't really happened yet, so you might see a read-only field related to that. But if we go to, for instance, maybe back to that appropriation ledger, here with appropriation ledger, I might want to, it's by the default, it sorts it by account code and then the post date. But this report also lists the transaction date on this report, so I could sort it by the transaction date, and then I can also group it by fund, or I could group it by program object code. So you'll have different sorting options for different types of reports. Sometimes you don't have any sorting options, like with appropriation status. Actually, I take that back. With that one, I do have a sorting option, but others you won't have that available. All right, if you look in the background here, you can see this Others tab. It says Departments. Well, that's a feature that we have not built into the software yet. We'll explain it once we provide a release for this update. It's an optional feature, and basically, I just wanted to make you aware of it. It's not relevant at this point in time, but we kind of built it in there so that when it is relevant, we'll just give you the ability to use it. And then if nothing falls into any of the categories on the screen here, we throw it right here under Options. So for instance, under the appropriation status, you have the option to start each fund on a separate page. Now you can see we have several funds. By default, if I display this, it goes from the, if I zoom in here a little bit, I've got all my general fund appropriation account codes, and then next, right below that is road and bridge. Well, if I select this checkbox, it'll start the Road and Bridge Fund at a separate page. So this is one option. Maybe we'll add more options in the future. If we do and it doesn't fit into any of these categories, look for the Options tab and you'll see that. Now we'll let you know if there's any new ones, but my point is that we've got some occasionally extra options, and so you can look at your different reports and see if there's anything available there. Not a lot of variety here right now in the reports we've looked at. Start each fund on the new page. All right, so that kind of covers the tabs. One thing I kind of skipped over was this year drop-down menu. You'll see this right now. We just have 2011, and because we just started this program, the version that we're looking at in 2011, and so that's our starting point. But as the time goes on, in other words, when you close and roll into 2012, and you'll get year-end procedures on how to do that. Once you get to 2012, you'll be able to print the reports for prior years, starting with 2011 going forward, from within the software itself. So you'll be able to go to the revenue budget and say, well, what was my revenue budget in 2011? I'm in 2012 now, and it'll display all the accounts that were active in that year, and you can print the budget report for 2011 while you're in 2012. Up to 5 years of prior year data, again, starting with 2011. So come, what is that, 2016, when you're live in 2016, live data, you can look back all the way to 2011 and print all of the relevant reports that you want to for that year or those years. Now, I won't get into it now, but for those of you who were on the older version of the UN software, you're probably already aware of a separate piece of software where you can go and print your prior years, such as 2010 and back. We retain on the computer up to 5 years of prior year data. After that, to save space on your hard drive, and for other reasons, we retain just 5 years. So eventually, 5 years past 2011, we'll have everything accessible within the software itself. All right. The next thing I want to point out is your buttons at the bottom here. For most reports, like here with the appropriation status, you have a print, display, and save as PDF, and then you'll have a grayed out option here for export. I'll show you that in a moment. And then you can click here to close the form. So if I click close, it just closes that area. I'll go back because I want to show you something there. So here we got the appropriation status, and some of this is pretty self-evident. If you select the items, click on print, it's going to print to the printer. You can choose the page range that you want to print. You could choose the number of copies, etc., and click the print button. And also, maybe if you have more, most people you're going to have the UN Dell printer provided, but if you have more than one, then you can print a different printer. All right, we've looked at the display, and I'll jump back to that in a moment to see some of the options I kind of overlooked in the past. But there's also the Save to PDF. Well, PDF is short for Adobe PDF file, and that will save a read-only file to your hard drive, okay, to your computer. So if I click on that for the appropriation status, it's going to save it. I've already got a few of them here already. It's going to save it to this file under my local disk, my C drive, my hard drive of my computer, and everything by default goes into the _UAN files. And that has to do with electronic files. You don't have to worry about what that means or anything. It'll be saved there. So it always shows up. If I go to my computer, it's outside of the UN software, or a browser like a Windows Explorer, open up the C drive and go to UAN e-files, there are all of my, list this in a number of different ways. Here are all the files I've saved to PDF so far. Well, I go back to the little Save As browser here. I can do this again. Click on Save to PDF. It opens up this Save As utility, Windows, and that's the default, UAN e-files. And then it labels it a file name. It date stamps it. It's military time, but it's 2011. Today's the September 2nd, and if you can read military time, you can see I'm working late today. But it'll date stamp it. You can always change this. Appropriation status before, if you want to. You can always change the description before changes, let's say. So you can rename that. It'll save it to this file format, Adobe Acrobat PDF. I can even save it somewhere else, like maybe my Documents folder. Not a bad idea, because that's where you do backups in UAN. We'll talk about that later, but or you can do a backup using the UAN software to back up that file that's external to UAN. But so yeah, maybe I'll do that. I'll save that under My Documents. So I'm going to save that. And so yeah, I'm not going to save it here. So I'll go to my Start menu. It's also on your desktop, My Documents. And there's my, I've got a few other things here, but there's my appropriation status before. If I double click on that, it opens up a file that's read-only. I've got to wait a little bit here for this computer. It's opening up. So we've got a few things going on. And this is a file, again, I can't type over this. It has all the features of Adobe Acrobat, and I could attach this file to an email. I could save it to a disk. We can back it, you know. It's something that external to the UAN software itself. So that's a nice little feature. Now, what's this export button all about? Well, that has to do with any file that is any report that's labeled export. Well, we don't have any here in the appropriation ledger, and we only have a few right now. We're expanding this as time goes on, but right now we have, if I go to receipt reports, I've got them for all of our major transactions, receipts, payments, and purchase orders, and I believe there might be a fund one as well. I've got a export report. So if I select under receipt reports, receipt export, maybe select year to date. I don't have many in my example, but if I select all, these are all the receipts that I've entered in UAN, and or whatever period I select, it'll list those. And notice everything else is grayed out. I can export this to an Excel spreadsheet. So this time I'll save it under e-files, and again it's labeled, and I'll save that. Labeled and date stamped. This takes a little bit longer because it's doing some formatting in Excel. And now if I go to my computer or a browser like Explorer, like Windows Explorer, local disk C, UAN e-files, there's my Excel spreadsheet for receipts. I can open up everyone. If you're on UAN, you have, oops, I need to do that. There we go. That's what I'm trying to do. If you're on UAN, you have Excel, and this is not read-only, so be careful who you send this to. But if you want to make your own customized report for receipts, you can do that. You can use all the features of Excel, so we don't support Excel or anything here at UAN, but you have it on your computer, and you can modify this, and maybe you want to make a customized report. It's available to you. I want to change this to standard and give it a more descriptive description or something like that. Obviously, you don't want to manipulate the data itself, but you may want to present it differently. And so this is an option that you have available to you to do just that. So I think it's a nice, this is kind of what, we're giving you what auditors only used to have. And so this may be expanded upon for different types of data in the future. But for the most part, all of your transactions, or your main transactions, revenue, receipts, and payments, those are definitely in there, as well as purchase orders. You have an option for that. All right, so that's export. So about display, let's look at, what's a good one? Maybe the fund ledger. That's not too bad. The fund ledger, that shows you everything related to all of your funds. I'll select year to date. That's a long report, and so I'm going to display that. Of course, I don't have much in my entity, but if you go to the entire year, this is going to be a very long report for a large entity. And here are a few options I have. I can press, I've been doing this throughout. I can zoom in or zoom out using these two buttons. I can use this to zoom in or zoom out, some preset settings, 100%, or if I want to really look tiny, I can go to 10%. That's not really useful, is it? But maybe 200%. If I really want to see it up close, oops, using the wrong button here. So 200%. Well, maybe I do want to view that. I don't want to print out. Maybe this is a 50-page report. I don't want to print it, but I want to look at something in detail. I keep clicking the wrong buttons. I'm sorry. So I can move around. I can use these arrows going right to left, or drag it back and forth, so that I can have the advantage of seeing something in large font, but at the same time I can move around pretty easily. A really nice feature, if you ever used like some of the internet tools they have here, this works the same way, some of your websites. I can describe what I'm doing here. Notice that we have the arrow for my mouse cursor. I'm going to right click on my mouse, and that changes to a little hand, sort of grabbing the page. And I'm just moving the mouse around with my holding down the, I'm sorry, not the right mouse, but the left mouse. And that allows me to drag it around. I find that feature to be very useful when I've got it zoomed in, like this. All right, now, so that's nice. And I also can page through. If this is 50 pages, I might want to just kind of page through this way. I can type in a specific page, page number 2, got 50 pages again. If I know which page, press enter, and it brings me to that page. Or I can toggle between the last page and the first page. Also, well, there's some other options here. We can look at the different page views. Not really very relevant for this report. And again, it kind of have to reset your screen back to 100%. But I'll go back to 200. And I could print, say I like what I see here. And first I wasn't sure if I wanted to waste a paper, but now I know I'd like to print this out and mark it up a bit. So I'm going to click on the print button. That brings up my print utility, and I can print it out. I can print out a few selected pages. Thumbnails, you might find that helpful. I'm not sure how you can expand that so you can view it a little bit more detail. Yeah, that's there. This, I think, is really useful, these binoculars in certain circumstances. Maybe at the end of the year, you've got 12 months worth of data. It's a detailed report, but you remember you threw something in there about, I had some kind of adjustment I did. Yeah, I did an adjustment, and I can't remember exactly what account code it was for, but I know it's in there somewhere. It was a rental deposit refund, right? Well, where is that? It's December 31st, and I know I need to look that up for whatever reason. I click on these binoculars, and it brings up this find utility. It's kind of a Windows thing. And I can type in rental. And let's say I got 100 pages here on a report. I can search for that. There's up and down to search up or down the pages. So I click on Find Next, and it'll show me every place on this report where rental is named. Well, there's only one place. Well, actually, there's a couple places. Rental, deposit, refund. So I can find every transaction there or action that I took that has the word rental in it, or put in a dollar amount. We'll say 100. It'll find, well, that shows me everything that has 100. But you get the idea. So that can be pretty useful sometimes. All right, so that's display. All right, and then finally, I've looked at all the printing buttons. We looked at most of our options here. Now I've got a few principles that I want to point out, and then we'll be finished. To illustrate this, we can look at the fund ledger again. Remember I said some reports show you a transaction date and a post date. Well, here's one of them. And the post date, you can go ahead and look back sometime at your key concepts for transactions. But the post date relates to the date that the effective date I entered in the software. So maybe if it was a receipt, that would be the post date for the receipt that I selected, or the if it were a purchase order, that would be, I believe, the issue date. If it was a payment, then it would be the date of the payment that I selected. But the transaction date is always the date that you click that post or the post print button. So in other words, you could have backdated or forward dated one of those transactions, but it's going to also record the date that you clicked that post print button. And that's the date that it increased or decreased your cash. So here we've got, if you can remember the columns, post is on the left, transaction date on the right. So here we got a number of examples where the post date does not equal the transaction date. And there's a lot of them because I came in here sometime or someone came in here sometime in April and backdated a whole bunch of transactions, so we would have a data set to look at. A lot of times, most of the time, they're probably going to equal. Sometimes you'll have dates that doesn't look like we have any here, where the post date is forward. So I might have 4/12 here for a transaction, and April 15th for my post date. So be aware of that. And so let's look at a different report to illustrate something I think that's important. Receipt reports is a good example, and we'll look at receipts, and let me close a few of these here. Keep revenues open. We're going to look at the revenue status and the receipt detail report. Okay, I had a transaction here, this receipt to the Parks Department. We did this one in one of our exercises, and I'm going to display that on the detail. This is a report that shows the detail of your receipts, as the name implies, and so there's quite a bit of detail here. Here we can see on this report that this posted as of my effective date, my transaction date that all occurred in April. That was when I clicked the post print button. But my actual date that I selected for the post date in the form for the receipt was February 25th. And that's when it was deposited at the bank for $150. But remember, we did that adjustment on February 28th, effective, and that reduced our receipt by $50. So that makes sense, right? It shows you the adjustment, negative adjustment. That's good. well, what happens if I do this? Now that's showing the month of February. Well, what if I use the select date period and so I make sure I get the right date. I select February 2nd, February 1st through February 25th. For whatever reason I'm taking a look at this. It's not the best example. This usually is a result of looking at different months, but since I only had pretty much 1 month of transactions, I've got to use the select date period. So really, a better example would be you reseeded it in January, and then in February you did an adjustment on it. But work with me on this. We're just going to select the date range. So ending date is the 25th. I'll select that reseed again. And we can see it's got the same information. It posted on the 28th. Notice my date range is the 25th. So it looks like it still shows me that information even though my date range is the 25th. But if I look over here at the adjustment, it still shows $50. But last time I checked my calculator, 150 minus 50 does not equal 150. So what's going on here? Blank stare for a moment. And then look at that little asterisk next to the $50. If you read the asterisked note here, it says, "Restricted amounts are not included in report totals. These transactions occurred outside the report date range, but are listed for your reference." So we try to, even though you selected a date range that did not cover this negative adjustment. And like I said, you probably see this if you selected, these were 2 different months. That's when you probably run into, missing this this negative transaction. But our programmer said, hey, we'll throw it in there for you, but we won't include it in the calculation to kind of illustrate that, it was outside this date range. But it shows you it anyway, so that's kind of nice. But for some reports, we could not do that. So for instance, with the revenue status, that's a point-in-time report, right? So if I go back here and I select on the revenue status February 25th, or again, if it's by the end of maybe the end of January, would be probably more relevant example. If I select that, and I forgot my account code already, this is dealing with account code 10802. So if I select my accounts, and I probably would end up printing all of them, but I'll just print that one for our example, and display it as of February 25th, I can see that I had a budget of $2,000 for this account code. I had revenue of $150. Well, that's not right because we reduced our revenue. Remember, we gave that John Q. Public his $50 deposit back. And so I've got to be aware of this as of date. So very important that you understand that dynamic. Now if I go back and select my revenue status and select today's date and select my account code again, well, that's as of the most current date on my calendar. And I zoom in, and now I can see the revenue. It accounts for that $50 that was adjusted, and my revenue is reduced. Okay, so that's going to be applicable for any of those reports. There's sort of a status report, or it has an as of date, or any that you can change the date range on. It may not be one of these status reports, but the types where you can adjust your, I probably won't find a good example here now that I'm looking for one. But anytime you can adjust your date range, or in this example we got, in this example we can actually see it, but so that's the main thing I wanted to illustrate there. And really, I will say I'll leave it at that for reports, and just encourage you to, well, I want to point out one other thing. I knew I was forgetting something. If we look here under Accounting Reports and Statements, I just wanted to point out a few pretty relevant reports. The managerial managerial reports. These are great for your board or council. And there's 3 of them right now. Like for instance, the fund summary report. That's as of type report here. And that doesn't show them a bunch of stuff that they may not want to, some of them may not want to see. So these are kind of nice in that respect. Here you just have like your starting fund balance. You've got your funds, month-to-date revenue, year-to-date revenue, expenditures, ending fund balance, current reserve for encumbrance, and the unencumbered balance per fund. So these are a lot of your summary level reports. Here's appropriation summary. So you might consider printing all of these for your board or council, and it gives you that high-level information without including all that account code level detail. And another one that a lot of people asked for we didn't have was this signature page. So I'll open that up. Notice that doesn't even have an area. Just select the date, and you can save that as PDF or display it or print it. And that's just a little report we added on that some folks requested, so I just wanted to point that out. And it's a signature page for your governing board for these different items. And yes, so I think I've touched on most of these reports. Make sure you really, if you don't review anything else, I'd say review the cash journal, like we'd mentioned before with the bank reconciliation, and those big 6 reports mentioned in Chapter 1. All right, so that's it for reports. Our next section is on the general, oh, and I forgot to mention, I did forget another thing, vendors payees. You'll want to look here. There's quite a few reports related to your vendors payees, and this is related to accounting, but it's located in the general reports and statements because of the fact that we'll have some new software coming up 2013, which will also be relevant for vendors and payees. So like I said, about 7, 8 reports there. And actually, there's another export report in that section as well. All right. Yes, like I said, the next video is on the general maintenance section.